I now yield to my distinguished colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Mr. Stallmer, Chairwoman Horn entered into the record the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration's letter supporting the FAA's NPRM for commercial space launch and reentry. However, your testimony highlights several issues with the FAA's proposed regulations. From your perspective, would these regulations advance U.S. leadership in commercial space or set us back? And if they would set us back, do you see a viable path to fixing that?
I think the regulations as they're currently written in this draft would definitely set us back. It tends to be more of the status quo. In a dynamic environment where innovation is occurring with new launch entrants, it creates more burdens for a lot of these new entrants, and especially in different categories. These rules are primarily written for expendable launch vehicles, which is more the legacy of the launch industry. It doesn't take into account capture carry hybrid reusable vehicles. So I think there's a path forward with recommendations that we've made that could benefit all the launch providers.
I got you. They need to be modernized a little bit for
I think updated with the
vehicles.
changing times.
Okay. All right, thank you. And Ms. Montgomery, is it Dr. or Mrs.?
Ms.
Mrs., okay. The U.S. Senate recently passed legislation to protect the Apollo landing sites. A companion bill was introduced in the House to commemorate Apollo 11. The bill would regulate private sector activity based on NASA policies without following the Administrative Procedures Act. It would also direct the administration to negotiate an international agreement to protect the sites. This is a very laudable goal, but is this the best way to conserve the sites? India recently launched a lander to the south pole of the moon, and if all goes well, presumably they would want to protect their first landing site. Could this bill set a precedent that precludes U.S. exploration of the lunar south pole, for instance, where there's billions of tons of water, and serve as a backdoor way of staking a claim, quote unquote, to regions on the moon? Your comments.
This is an issue that has only been something I've recently thought about, so these are more recent thoughts. One concern I would have about the way the bill works is that internationally there may be some concern that attempts to set up an exclusion zone could constitute national appropriation. And so I don't know where the thinking is on that, but it would certainly be something to explore as a possible concern under the Outer Space Treaty, because the Article 2 does bar national appropriation. Secondly, I would worry about whether it allows for emergency landings, because some of those policies may not allow that. My third concern with it is that both bills provide that the NASA policy would apply, and NASA is not a regulatory agency, and so it is not, the policies have been written without going through the notice and comment period.
All right, thank you. And Mr. French, the Department of Defense developed the Atlas and Delta launch vehicles with a 75–80% of funding coming from the contractors, and only 20 to 25% coming from the taxpayer. NASA developed the commercial cargo program by sharing their development costs with SpaceX and Orbital Sciences 50-50. SpaceX and Boeing currently receive 90% of their development funding for the commercial crew program from the taxpayer. NASA recently announced that the lunar landers will also be funded by the taxpayer at least 90%. The rationale for the early partnerships was that contractor could also sell to other customers, which would lower the government's cost. The success of such an approach is dependent upon the potential market outside of the U.S. government. There appears to be a market for robotic landers, but is there a market outside of NASA for human-rated lunar landers that could defray the cost of the government and justify a public-private partnership at this point?
Thank you, sir. there's no current market in this area, unlike the case of the multi-billion-dollar commercial launch market. And so it raises that risk of, are you possibly excluding some pretty capable companies if you require them to put money in an area where they aren't able to realize a return in a 5 to 7 year period where they have to make those decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. And I am expired, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Well, it looks like you're still here, but your time is up, so don't go anywhere. We like having you around.